In this conversation, I get to speak with Dr. Aubrey de Grey. Aubrey is a pioneering biomedical gerontologist. He's also the co founder of the SENSE Institute, dedicated to finding innovative strategies to combat aging and to extend human life. I found this discussion really useful and entertaining. I have been following this subject for many years now. If this topic is new to you, then I would humbly urge that you do not discard it offhand. Do look into it further, and I'm sure you're going to be fascinated and surprised by the information you find. As Aubrey says, the best thing that we can do to help is to spread the news and to make this information as widely available as possible so that this research gets more public funding and support. So with that in mind, please do not forget to share the video. This will really help. Thank you. And now let's get started. Aubrey, hello. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you very much. So tell us, you work in the longevity field. Would you like to just describe a little bit what you do and how you describe what you do, how you title it?
Sure, yeah. So you're quite right. I work on longevity. I work on aging. I'm not in favor of aging. I'm trying to fix it. The essentially the technical term for that is I'm a biomedical gerontologist, which means that I work on the development of new treatments that will be able to keep people healthy for a lot longer than we are at the moment, and of course, as a side effect, keep people alive for a lot longer. And the work that I've been doing has been going on for maybe 30 years now. About 25 years ago, I had a kind of eureka moment that has more or less defined everything I've done since. And that is to do with the general approach to bringing aging under medical control, which is what this is all about. That approach that I pioneered back then, and which took a while to be understood and to become mainstream, but it very much is now, is basically preventative maintenance. So we're interested in taking people who may be already in middle age, but who are still basically healthy, and repairing the molecular and cellular damage that they have been accumulating throughout their lives as a consequence of normal metabolism, of the way the body normally works. Uh, Essentially, it's those changes, that damage that accumulates, which eventually causes the health problems of late life, whether mental or physical. And just in the same way that a car, accumulates rust throughout its existence, and eventually the doors fall off. Similarly, the way to stop the doors from falling off is to remove the rust every so often before it gets that far, before there's too much rust. So it's basically the same thing, but for this very, very much more complicated machine called the human body.
Thank you for that. Before we open up the discussion and go further down it, would you mind just maybe defining how do you define aging?
Yes, good question. And of course, the first thing is it's extraordinary that you need to ask that question, that anyone needs to ask it. Because let's face it, aging has been the number one preoccupation of the human race since the beginning of civilization. So it's fairly shocking that we haven't come up with an agreed definition of it. But my definition really comes back to my previous answer, actually, to what I said about what I do, because I like to have a definition that demystifies aging, that makes people understand that it's not this kind of mysterious enigma. Um, and so it's really about this damage that I just spoke about. That aging is the combination of two processes. First of all, this lifelong process where the network of things that keep our bodies going from one day to the next, the thing I call metabolism, generates these changes, these various types of molecular and cellular damage. And then the second process, which kicks off late in life, where the damage has become more abundant than what the body is set up to tolerate. And that's the process of progression of these chronic conditions of late life, including all of the things that we call the age-related diseases, nearly all cancers, heart disease of various types, Alzheimer's disease, osteoporosis, you name it.
Thank you. I actually first um, discovered this topic when I've been following Ray Kurzweil for many years. Um, and I know Ray Kurzweil talks about like kind of living for a long, long time. But I didn't actually know about all of that. I was following Ray Kurzweil more in terms of like computer development and other things. And it was just only quite late that I realized that this is what he's talking about. And because I paid so much um, um, weight to everything Ray Kurzweil says, when he was talking about longevity, I kind of started taking that seriously. And I remember at that time, and from there, I started looking into other things like NMNs and all of those things. And I spoke to some of my friends and relatives who are doctors, and even at that stage, they were skeptical because they were saying that like is with the development of science, how far we've come to, um, lifespan hasn't actually increased as much as you'd think. So what makes you think that going forward now we're going to have such a huge leap? And some of those people are now kind of coming around to that kind of understanding, because the more you look into it, you kind of learn things. But would you mind telling us that actually, first of all, um, how has lifespans increased significantly if we look at past history? And if not, why do we believe that going forward we're going to have such a huge leap?
Yeah, so this is the kind of question that arises from essentially a misunderstanding of the way that pioneering technology works. If we look at exactly the thing you just asked, the past trajectory of changes in lifespan, then we see that it is not a smooth, linear, or accelerating process at all. Basically, since prehistory until about 200 years ago, there was essentially no progress at all in the average longevity of the human race. We were still dying around the age of late 20s, maybe 30, right? And then modern medicine happened in the 19th century. Edward Jenner and Louis Pasteur and people figured out little things like that, hygiene is quite a good idea, and that, how to do vaccines and antibiotics and so on. And the result was that a large proportion of the things that had been responsible for short lifespans in the past were virtually abolished very, very quickly over a period of a couple of decades in the whole of the industrialized world. And of course, it's still proceeding to become more universal in the poorer countries of the world. But yeah, I mean, that's all it took. So we went from a point where average lifespan was maybe 30 to a point where it was 70 or 80 in very little time indeed. Now, the question then is, what happened next? And of course, the answer is that other causes of death um, dominated. This is the result was people were living long enough to experience the causes of death that have to do with having been born a long time ago. And you can't make progress, any more progress again in terms of increasing lifespan until you start addressing those things. Because once hardly anybody's dying from infections in early in life, you can't make any further improvement by bringing that number down even further. Um, and so the first thing that I always begin my lectures with is I emphasize that this is not a surprise, that the types of medicine that work so well against most infections, of course, not absolutely every infection, we've had to work hard against HIV and COVID and so on, um, but against most infections, don't work at all to speak of against the intrinsic health problems that are caused by the gradual progressive accumulation of damage in the body that I just spoke about. We've got to develop a whole new type of medicine for that. And of course, we have seen progress in the past, let's say 50 or 70 years in longevity, but it's been very slow. And it's really only resulted from prosperity. It's resulted from people having better nutrition, especially early in life. Turns out prenatal nutrition matters a lot in terms of how long you live, in terms of how soon you get the progressive conditions of late life. But that, of course, is hitting diminishing returns now, because the people who are getting to the age of 80 were born in a world that was relatively prosperous compared to people who were 80, 50 years ago. So now we're seeing this plateauing. In fact, in some countries, the um, life expectancy is actually slightly going down because of the obesity epidemic and so on. So yes, we absolutely need a whole new thing. So the question is, how can people like Ray or myself look at the world today and be so optimistic about how soon we're likely to achieve much more. And there are two answers to that. The first one is emphasizing the word likely. When I give predictions about how long it's going to be before we make big inroads into aging, I always say it probabilistically. I say, I think we have a 50-50 chance of making this amount of progress in this amount of time. And you have to do that because any pioneering technology, you have no idea what kind of unforeseen obstacles you're going to encounter. But the second thing is the concept of longevity escape velocity, which I first put forward more than 20 years ago now. And this is the concept that we don't have to solve the whole problem at once in order to stay one step ahead of the problem, so to speak. If we look at the body, as I mentioned earlier, it's an unimaginably complicated machine, and we have the handicap that we don't really understand well. Figure this preventative maintenance that I'm about is actually, a bit of a challenge in the first place. But even if we can do it, the point is some of the types of damage that the body accumulates will inherently be easier to repair than others. And therefore, we have to ask, how are we going to extend life unless we can repair all the types of damage, right? Because, any type of damage, if we don't slow down its accumulation, it's going to be able to kill you more or less on schedule, however well we fix all the others. This is a divide and conquer approach, right? All right, well, so the answer is that we do have to be fairly comprehensive in hitting the various types of damage, but not 100%. Because if we can be comprehensive enough to get maybe 20 years of additional life, starting when we give, let's say, people who are 60 years old these interventions, then so they won't be biologically 60 again in terms of their health until they're 80, right? Then we will be able to use those 20 years to improve the comprehensiveness of the interventions, of the treatments. So that when the 80-year-old comes back, even though inherently they're not really biologically 60 because the damage that they have in the body is all difficult damage that the therapy doesn't work on, right? Nevertheless, we will be able to re-rejuvenate them because our treatments will be better. And so if we just continue that over time, just improving faster than time is passing, then it's as if, people never get to be biologically old enough to get sick. In other words, it's as if we did have 100% comprehensive treatments from the beginning. So yeah, that's really a large part of the reason why I can be so optimistic and say things like, I think that it's highly likely that the first person to live to 1,000 is already alive.
Well, that's what I've heard Ray say as well. Actually, has Ray ever called you? The reason I'm asking is because there's lots of different people talking about longevity from different points of view. So when he talks about longevity, is he talking about similar um, developments that you're working on, or is he thinking of something completely different?
Oh no, he's very much thinking the same things. And of course, yes, Ray and I know each other quite well. Um,
Okay.
So in his first book on this subject, Fantastic Voyage, he essentially put forward pretty much the same concept that I've just described using this term longevity escape velocity. He called it living long enough to live forever, right? So in other words, he was again talking about this stepwise thing. And he highlighted three bridges, as he called them, three phases to this thing. First of all, he talked about about what we can do already, right? Supplements and diet and lifestyle and so on. That was his bridge one. Then bridge two was essentially biotechnology. So that's more or less my stuff. If you read the details of what he's written on that, whether in that book or in subsequent books, you'll see there's references to my work all over it, and it's basically the same thing. And then bridge three is to do with the merging of man and machine, uploading, things like that. My view is that bridge three makes sense, but it may very well not happen because we may not need it. We may be able to, we may just carry on, living in these rather vulnerable wet bodies and just, protecting them, whether by medicine or by other things to stop us from being hit by trucks and so on. And so the motivation for transitioning to other hardware may not be sufficient to make it actually happen. However, technologically, I think he's absolutely on the mark. Um, as for Bridge One, there Ray and I are often contrasted because Ray takes a couple of hundred different supplements every day, and I don't take any. And people say, well, they must disagree about this. That's not really true, or at least it's not nearly as true as it might seem on the surface. Because the main thing there is that different people have very, very different metabolisms and different weak links, so to speak, in their metabolism. And Red's got a lot of weak links. He drew a bunch of short straws. He has a lot of cardiovascular disease in his family. He came down with type 2 diabetes in his 30s, which is not unheard of, but it's rare. And that was actually the inspiration for him to develop his own regime that he has. He found that classical treatments for diabetes didn't work for him, so he developed his own. Um, on the other hand, I haven't drawn any short straws. I'm really on the lucky end of the spectrum. Whenever I get measured in terms of my biological age by any means, I always come out ridiculously young. So for me, the sensible thing to do is to be conservative and say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Excellent. Let me just for the audience listening, because when I first heard, I don't know if it was from yourself, but it was just in the news, and I can't remember what doctor or scientist they were referring to. But there was the first time I heard about like people working on um, potentially living forever. I come from a Muslim background. Maybe a lot of my listeners also come from a Muslim or religious background. When it comes to Islam, we are told that every, not just every human being, but every being, every entity will face death. So at the time, I kindly just laughed this off, thinking, ha ha ha, they'll find out this is not going to work. But then the way I understand it now is you're not necessarily saying we're not going to die. You're just saying we're not going to die from long age diseases. That's one thing. I mean, you might think we're not going to die, period, from because other developments as well. But I'm just trying to say how I kind of understand this, and that we shouldn't just dismiss this offhand for religious
Absolutely.
reasons or other reasons, like I did before.
You're completely right. Thank you for raising that. The work that this is all about is addressing one particular cause of death, and furthermore, it happens to be the cause of death that not only kills the majority of people worldwide, but also it causes by far the most amount of suffering. Before you die, and of course, loss of quality of life of your loved ones as well. So it's definitely God's work to alleviate all of that. And as you say, last I checked, God was supposed to be omnipotent, so he can perfectly well strike you down with a thunderbolt, however healthy you are. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, I am very happy that there are people working on self-driving cars and asteroid detection and so on. But you don't need that to get to 1,000-year lifespans
Yeah,
because if you look at the statistics today in the industrialized world, your typical person is, let's say, they reach the age of 26. Their chance of not reaching the age of 27 is less than 1 in 1,000, right? That's just statistics today. So if we eliminate aging completely, or we eliminate it fast enough, as I mentioned, using longevity escape velocity, then even if we did not reduce the incidence of death from any other cause at all forever, you'd still have most people living to 1,000, right? But they'd still be dying of something
yeah,
at some point.
that's amazing. When you talk about probability, and you're saying you like to think of things as probability of when science will develop enough, you're talking about probability of when it will happen. You're not talking about probability of whether it will happen or not. Are
That's
you
correct. Yeah.
certain that we're going to get to that point at some stage?
At this point, I would say yes. I am absolutely certain that we will bring aging under really comprehensive medical control eventually. The hypothesis that there might be something that would forever stop that from happening is just kind of, it contravenes the laws of physics. There's just no way that we could possibly have some kind of truly impregnable barrier. So the only actual barrier would be if we decided we didn't want to. and that's not going to happen. People don't like getting sick, and people are never going to like getting sick.
And the other thing is, so you're talking about when someone has received treatment, and let's say when they're 80, their biological age will be 60.
Mm.
Um, and then when the biological age becomes 80. But basically, what I'm trying to say is that, first of all, is this treatment a one off treatment? Because what I'm thinking is, if they're 80, why do they stop at 60? We could just take them back all the way to 30 or something, and they never get to 60, no?
You're completely right. This analogy that I often use with simple man-made machines like cars is a very useful analogy because it's really genuinely a valid analogy. In the same way you do periodic, maintenance on your car, right? You get rid of the rust every so often.
Yeah,
So you're absolutely right. The only reason why the first treatment that someone gets when they're 60 would only take them back by 20 years to, let's say, biologically 40 rather than biologically 20 or less is because the treatments are not comprehensive at that time. They're only they're version 1.0, right? And when you're 80, yeah, we'll be able to take you back further and so on. Now, when I say back younger than 20, of course, I have to explain carefully what I mean because I'm only talking about aging. I'm not talking about development. So people would definitely continue to remain adults. It wouldn't be a Benjamin Button thing, right?
yeah.
Um, but the amount of damage that they would have in their body could certainly be reduced to a level below what a typical 20-year-old today has.
Wow. When people listen to this for the first time, for all sorts of reasons, they would instantly think this is a nightmare scenario. Like, first of all, they'll say, why would I want to live forever? What am I going to do? Whereas if I had more time, the amount of studies I could do, the amount of knowledge I can get is just awesome. But anyway, one of the things that came to my mind initially in that vein of like nightmare scenarios is population. Like how do we, if no one's dying and people may stop reproducing at some stage, but that's not going to happen immediately. So people are being born, no one's dying. Where's everyone going to go? And I've heard Ray talk about this, and it makes a lot of sense. But I want to know your point of view.
Yeah, so one of the things I've had to get used to over the years is what I call the pro-aging trance. The fact that it doesn't matter how often I explain, as carefully as I can why these particular so-called nightmare scenarios are actual nonsense. Nobody will ever listen, and the reason they won't listen is because they don't want to listen. They want to believe that aging is some kind of blessing in disguise. Why do they want to do that? They want to do it because I'm only giving probabilities, and
Yeah,
therefore they don't want to get their hopes up.
I think you're
Right?
right.
That aging is so utterly ghastly that the only way that most people can cope with it is to put it out of their minds and get on with their miserably short lives and make the best of it rather than being preoccupied by this terrible thing and getting emotionally invested in the time frames for how soon we're going to bring it under control. So, I mean, just to give one illustration, let's use the one that you just used, the one of overpopulation.
Yeah,
Even if one takes a worst case scenario where, first of all death stops, and fertility rates stay a day, which we know is a ridiculously overpessimistic scenario because we've seen in the past that fertility rates come down all the time. Um, Even in that scenario, then you can do the numbers, you can do the calculations and ask, how many people would there be X years in the future? Now, of course, we constantly worry about overpopulation today, but that's not because we don't have enough space. It's because we have too much pollution per person, right? Every person that's alive today is generating a lot of, carbon in the atmosphere and so on and so forth. And hello, we're working on that, right? So I mean, carbon capture and bacteria that eat plastics and so on. These things are coming, and we know that those things are going to happen way before there could be any demographic consequences of bringing aging under control. So, whatever happens with aging, we're going to see a reduction in the so-called overpopulation problem, not an increase, until such time as we do get so many people that that we'd start to have a problem with space. But you can think about how long that's going to be just by looking at how many people we have today and how much space we have. if you do that calculation, every single person on the planet could have their own acre, right? And you wouldn't even need to put anywhere unpleasant.
Yeah,
Um, so there's a lot of time. And then we have to come to the question, well, okay, people will say, well, okay, maybe it's going to be a long time, but it's going to happen sometime. The question is whether it makes moral sense to base one's decisions about what to do today and how much suffering to alleviate today based on one's imagination of what life's going to be like in the distant future. And I say that's completely immoral because we have I mean, even 50 years in the future, we have no idea what the world's going to be like. There's so many unknown unknowns. So it's just immoral to make decisions that way. We have to develop these therapies to save as many lives as we can as soon as possible, just because we know that people don't want to get sick. And we can be very sure that nobody's ever going to want to get sick.
exactly. I think that's very well said for, especially for a physician, that the moral, the ethical concern should be to alleviate the problem at hand, related, and not imagine something that might happen in the future.
Yeah.
Um, One of the things that I really liked about, like, Ray Kurzweil was talking about, and it opened my mind to this whole thing, was that, so he was talking about how currently the problem isn't that there isn't enough space. The problem is that we have very densely populated areas where there's not enough space. We've got very densely populated cities, but there's other developments going on. For example, virtual reality, all of those things that necessitate that in future people won't have to live in such densely populated areas because everything doesn't need to be at hand all the time. We can virtually be in places. I could be in New York right now, exploring the streets while I'm sitting in my home. So when that happens, then people can disperse more widely, and there's a lot more space on Earth than what we're using at the moment. And I thought that was a good way of looking at it.
Yeah, I'm not actually all that convinced by that argument.
No?
Just intuitively, it seems to me that the reason we have the highly densely populated cities that we have today is because people like living near to each other. People actually do enjoy living in cities, and there's a constant migration into cities. Even though it's typically more expensive to live in the city and so on. Um, so I'm not actually sure that works, but
That's true.
you know, I'm not a I mean I'm a recreational sociologist, right? I
Yes,
don't have any actual idea whether that's true or not.
sure.
And again, so is Ray. So it's not for us to say really. What it is for us to say is that we have a moral obligation to develop the choice, to give people the options to live the way they want to live.
Sure. I wanted to talk to you about how you're doing what you're doing and what the science is behind it. But before that, I just wanted to further just explore these kind of scenarios because they're just so interesting. So one of the things I wanted to know is, so from your point of view, when is there a threshold that we're going? You talk about escape velocity. When do you think we'll hit that?
I think we have a 50-50 chance of getting to that point within about 12 to 15 years from now. So in other words, the second half of the 2030s. That's slightly less optimistic than Ray, but we're in each other's range kind of thing.
Okay. And if I asked you, because you've been working on in this field for decades now, so if I asked you this same question, let's say 10 years ago, what would you have said?
Yeah, great question. So actually, I started giving predictions about 20 years ago.
Okay.
And back then I said it's going to be about 25 years. And if we look 10 years ago, I was still saying, well, I was probably saying 20 to 25 years. So in other words, there had been much less progress than I had been predicting. My timeframes had been slipping. But if you think about that, then in the past 10 years, the second 10, there's been almost no slippage at all. And that's really encouraging, of course, because we have to ask ourselves, why was there slippage in the first 10 years and not the second? And the answer is money. That at first I was pretty optimistic that we were going to be able to, since finally we had a plan, the plan that I'd put forward starting in the year 2000, to actually bring aging under control, that people would, pick up on that plan and start implementing it and throwing the relevant money at it and so on. And that basically didn't happen, or hardly happened. So progress was at least 3 times slower than I had anticipated. But around the years, around 2014 or so, 2015, that did start to change, largely because the plan that I put forward, this divide and conquer damage repair approach, kind of got the stamp of approval from the mainstream in 2013. Um, and um, and so, but after that, people started to think much more positively about it. And in particular, the private sector started getting heavily involved, starting in about 2016, 2017. Um, so, there's people who actually want to make money out of this, and therefore they want to see a return on investment. They want to think about timeframes. Anyone who wants to make money wants to make it tomorrow. So, so that meant that investors write bigger checks than donors do. Simple as that. So we started getting a lot faster progress. I do want to emphasize, though, that even today, that increased financial support for this work is very unevenly distributed. It is generally going to the low-hanging fruit, the areas that are most easy to make money out of quickly, right? And of course, as I say, because it's a divide and conquer strategy, we can't just be focusing on the low-hanging fruit. So I've tried to compensate for that by working on the more difficult areas, the more neglected areas. Coming back to what you mentioned earlier about being of Muslim ancestry and so on, I should mention that there is a really big player in this field now, which is called the Revolution Foundation, and it's based in Riyadh, and it's funded entirely by the Saudi royal family.
Oh, wow.
So,
I had no
so
idea.
well, there you go. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of interest in this area in the Arab world right now, in the Muslim world,
Oh, wow.
and and that money, interestingly, is philanthropic. It's been given as grants, or to the extent that they do make investments, they have a commitment to fold any profits back into the philanthropic side. So that sounds like it solves the problem I just described. Unfortunately, it doesn't, because as things stand, they have decided to be extremely politically correct and fund stuff through the same kind of decision-making processes that are used in governments around the world, which means that difficult things that are not likely to lead to high-profile publications in the next 6 months are deprioritized. So evolution is making much less difference than it could be, but it is putting $1 billion a year. Well, that's what they're going to do eventually. It's more like a third of that at the moment into into this research, which is definitely a lot better than not putting that money in.
Wow, that's really interesting. And I think it's going to be interesting for my audience as well to better be able to relate to it, everything that you're saying. I will get in touch with them as well. Um, so I think it's interesting you're talking about money, profits, investment. Um, I come from a business background, so I kind of completely understand the risk reward kind of aspect of progress and development. But for a lot of people, as soon as we talk about money, they start thinking, oh my God, this is like. So when you talk about, for example, escape velocity, what does that look like? Is that so now there's some people who can live forever,
Mm-hmm.
but that will be so expensive, presumably, that that's just going to be in the domain of the very rich and wealthy. Is that how you see it, initially at least?
Oh, certainly not. And the reason I don't see it that way is indeed all about money,
Hmm.
because what we want to think of is the return on investment of the people who have developed the treatments that we're talking about. They won't make much money by selling things at a high price to a very small number of people. They will make their money by making things affordable to everybody. And of course, that is the way any technology works. This technology, the situation is even better than usual because we will see it coming. In other words, everyone knows that these things are being developed now, and everyone's preparing it. And when I say everyone, I include policymakers, I include governments. So by the time these therapies are even slightly ready for prime time, in other words, available to anybody, however wealthy they may be,
Yeah.
governments will understand that there is a straightforward mercenary economic imperative to ensure that they are available to everybody who's old enough to need them, simply because not having those therapies is so expensive. Today, the overwhelming majority of the medical budget of the Western world goes on the health problems of late life. So preventative medicine that does this damage repair and stops people from getting to exhibit those problems even if delivering those medicines is fairly expensive, which I guess it probably will be at first, like any new technology, um, it will still pay for itself at the level of governments, at the level of nations and GDP and so on, many times over, insanely quickly. And governments will know that before the therapies arrive. So they will do the front loading of investment and infrastructure and so on that's necessary. And if that requires, manipulation of the system for providing medical care, so the hell what? That's fine. This is completely independent of whether you're living in a country that has a national health service, or whether you're living in a crazy country like I am now that pays for everything by insurance. You know, that's what taxation and incentives are for. You just make sure that everybody gets what they want, and you can, because you've got so much money to throw around that you're saving from using this technology broadly. So that's absolutely, you don't need to rely on any kind of moral humanitarian imperative. You don't even need to rely on an electoral imperative, which certainly will exist, of course.
Yeah.
No one's going to get elected unless they have a manifesto commitment to do this. You can just talk about the economics.
Something just came to my mind as you were describing that, and a little bit is related to what happened with the COVID and the treatments that were coming out of COVID, and how geopolitics got involved. And so China has its own medicine, US has its own medicine, Russia has got its own stuff, and they're only sharing it with their friends and allies. Do you see a situation like that where we go, okay, now we've got the medicine, we can live for a long time, and let those people over there just kind of pass away, let nature do its course?
Yeah, definitely not. Again, comes down to the money. You know, every country has its price. If this gets developed in one place and the other place wants it, the other place will pay for it because they can, because they will save so much money from having it. But of course, we can go further than that, because this is a divide and conquer strategy, which means that you're going to have different things developed in different places by different people, and it will only deliver the jackpot if one has the relevant collaboration and cooperation. And this is true at the level of countries, the way you described it, and it's also true, of course, at the level of companies that will, engage in whatever cross-licensing or whatever that may be needed.
And so when I asked you earlier, when you think escape velocity is going to take place, and also what would you have said if someone had asked you 10 years ago? It's interesting actually, because I thought the time period would have um, um, sped up rather than slip away. And the reason I thought that is because of the technology, the development that's going on, from genomics to, I don't know, artificial intelligence, computing power, all of those other things. So why did those things not so far kind of make a dent in that timeline, do you think? Or is that irrelevant science,
Well,
that bit
it
of science?
depends what you mean by making a dent, really. I mean, I was taking into account my expectations of progress when I was making these predictions.
True.
And so I was not. It wasn't like some, out of this world pleasant surprise when we figured out how to sequence the genome, or when we figured out how to predict the three-dimensional shape of a protein from its amino acid sequence. You don't know when these things are going to happen, but you have a feel for how rapidly the relevant technologies are improving, and so you can take it from there.
Yes.
I mean, taking the genome as a good example, because it's often used, including Ray uses this one. It's all about the cost of sequencing the human genome, right? It cost a few billion the first time, and now it costs about $1,000. So this is something that's followed very much the same kind of trajectory that computer speeds have followed for even more decades. And you know, Ray is all about these predictions of rates of progress, and he's of course very strong on the fact that these rates are not linear; they're exponential. Um, but yeah, I mean, his predictions have been reasonably good in terms of time frames in across many domains of technology. And so I've been doing the same thing, which means that the only surprise that I have had over these 20 years in terms of timeframes is the bad surprise that the money didn't come in until more recently.
Let me just take a moment's break to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is proudly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a e-commerce marketing agency specializing in making brands successful on Amazon. So if you are thinking of starting a new venture, or if you already have a brand and you want to take it to that next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. For transparency purposes, let me also tell you that WLC is actually a company that I founded and am the director of. When you get in touch with WLT, you'll be getting in touch with me and my team, and we look forward to greeting you and seeing how we can help. Thank you, and now let's get back to the episode. By the way, so you said things kind of sped up since about 2013. What happened in 2013 that thing changed things?
Right. So yeah. So as I say, I put forward this whole damage repair paradigm, which was really the first time anyone had put forward a concrete plan for bringing aging under control. That was in the year 2000, published in 2020, 2002. And I talked about it all over the place, of course, and it was a huge paradigm shift. The expert community had been completely focused on the idea that the only way we were ever going to be able to keep people alive in a healthy state for a longer amount of time was by essentially making the body run more cleanly, making it damage itself more slowly than it normally would, rather than repairing damage that had already happened. And it took me a good few years to convince my colleagues in the community that that made any sense. And of course, you know, a lot of people in every community have big egos and are not interested in new ideas necessarily. So, Gandhi said it rather well. He said, first they ignore you and then they ridicule you and then they fight you and then they say they were with you all along. And various other people like Arthur C. Clarke and Schopenhauer and so on have said the same thing. So I very much went through those Gandhi stages, as I like to
Yeah.
call them. And it all really didn't really conclude. It didn't really get to the point of having won the argument until about 2008, 2009. And then it took a few more years for the dust to properly settle, because there were various people who didn't talk to each other around that time. Um, um, but yeah, then in 2013, the real coup de grace happened, which was the publication of an extremely influential paper called The Hallmarks of Aging. This was published by 5 extremely credentialed, very, very well respected gerontologists.
Mhm.
And it was essentially a not terribly good, in fact, restatement of what I'd said a decade earlier. But the point is, it was basically a restatement. It was essentially, yeah, we have this variety of different things that go wrong in the body and the variety of ways we might fix them. And and it was published in a top journal, and the time was right. I had done the hard work, the preparation, so to speak, which means that the paper was immediately embraced by absolutely everybody. It became the Bible of the field. So it is by now, by far, the most highly cited paper in the whole of the biology of aging this century, and it's definitely going to stay that way. Um, and so basically, since then, one was not risking one's reputation by going along with this and being more focused on prevention, on doing something about aging. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, literally you could not mention the idea of actually intervening in aging in a grant application at all. It would be, you would totally be laughed out of court. And that had become the case since probably the 60s, basically because gerontologists had realized that making the body run more cleanly, making damage be generated more slowly, was just not going to happen. It was just like you couldn't do it because the creation of damage is too intrinsically intertwined with the processes that body needs to do to keep us alive. If you try to stop it from creating damage, you're also going to stop it from doing things that we need it to do, and you're going to have unintended consequences.
Very true. So when we talk about escape velocity, what does that look like? Is it like a threshold? Is it that case that until we approach that point, we continue as normal, and then bam, we're like now living hundreds of years? Or is it like a um, progression that starts before we get there, that people live longer and longer, and then gradually
It,
get to that point?
it, it's pretty much the first of those. So a friend of mine actually coined the word the Methuselarity to kind of, compare it with the singularity, where you've got this point where everything changes. So yes, we will have this very, very rapid transition from a world in which people are living only a little bit longer than they are now, if that, to when people can expect to live indefinitely. Not, as I say, not because the therapies are 100% perfect, but because they're close enough to perfect that we buy ourselves time fast enough to keep improving them. Um, yeah, and it's a bit of a shock, and certainly from the point of view of anyone trying to make predictions, and trying to model this, like demographically or economically or whatever, people have been a bit slow, to be honest, to actually get in there. The person who's in the lead in terms of the economics is a very, very well-respected guy named Andrew Scott, who's based in London at the London Business School, I think. He has been the first credentialed economist to really bite this bullet and talk about what he calls the Wolverine scenario, the scenario where we have medicines that can reverse biological age. But even he hasn't done it right, not yet, because he hasn't yet incorporated this very necessary component of the therapies becoming progressively better over time.
And so if also what I think, and I think about this quite often, not just about this, but generally about healthcare. How is it that when it came to the vaccines for coronavirus, we started from scratch? There was no kind of prior vaccination. There was nothing, and then all of a sudden, we put our heads together and we came up with something so quickly. So why can't we do that with more and more? Like, what science was used? Was that like artificial intelligence? What methods were used to speed that process up? And why can't we use that kind of working, but also uh, kind of joint effort to pick up, like, whether it's cancer, heart disease, or whatever it is, and then just kind of get to the end of it?
Mhm. Well, the short answer is that the reason why we got COVID vaccines like literally 10 times faster than any previous vaccine had ever been developed was
Yeah.
not really to do with new science.
Okay.
The science that underpinned the vaccines that went out, especially the mRNA vaccines, had already been developed by various companies, especially Moderna, and it was, it was in the process of being developed. What was radically different with COVID was how the regulatory process was handled. In the standard situation, when some particular infection or whatever is affecting only a very small number of people, or maybe it's affecting a lot of people, but they get over it anyway, like flu or whatever, um, then somehow the attitude of society, and of course I'm talking very generally here, but it really is a very general phenomenon across the world. The attitude of society is extreme risk aversion. They are very much more interested in not killing people with a new therapy than they are in not in saving lives with a new therapy. So, when anyone dies in a clinical trial, typically, then there's a huge uproar,
Yeah.
even when one person dies, right? As a result of a treatment.
Even if they don't
Whereas,
die, even if there's like a side effect or something, there's like
well,
panic.
well, that's right. Whereas if the process of regulatory approval takes unnecessarily long, and the result is a lot of people die because they couldn't get something that they would have been able to get, then it doesn't make headlines at all,
Yeah.
right? So that's why the regulatory process is so extraordinarily glacial. It's it's all the fault of the public, who refuse to be quantitative about risk benefit ratios. Um, it's so people get, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the UK, in the US, they get all the blame, but they're just implementing government policy, and the government get the blame, but they're just implementing public opinion.
Public sentiment.
So,
Yeah.
so the difference, of course, with COVID was that everybody was actually quite upset about COVID, right? And so they wanted things to be addressed really quickly, and bang, sure enough, it was done. And of course, it will be done in the future as well.
So let's talk about a bit about like the scientific method now that you're applying. But if you could kindly explain it in a way that a layperson like myself could understand, what is it that you're working on, and what is this, like gene therapy? Is it stem
Mhm.
cell? What kind of things are we looking at?
Yeah. So first of all, let me steer you away from the phrase "the scientific method," because that's normally a term used for testing hypotheses, for finding things out. And I'm not a basic scientist. I don't find things out for the sake of finding things out. I find things out for the sake of developing technologies that can improve the quality of life of people, and of course the quantity of life of people. Um, so, but leaving that aside for one moment, what are we working on? Well, so because the whole damage repair approach is a divide and conquer approach, we have to make sure that the um, um, the things work together. So we have to develop the individual components, but then we have to put them together. In many technologies, the putting together part is basically easy. You kind of know that if the individual bits work, then the complete thing is also going to work. In medicine, it's not like that at all, because we're working with a system that we have such poor understanding of. So it's much more likely that you will get surprises, including bad surprises, when you put things together. They will interact in unpredictable ways. Um, Therefore, um, we need to work on both of those things. But you can't work on the second one until you've done the first one, at least done some of the first one. And that's the situation we're in now. But we've only been in it for, I don't know, a few years maximum. It's now possible to take some of the more straightforward damage repair approaches, not in people, but in mice, right? And put them together in the same mice at the same time and see what happens. And we are doing exactly that. And everybody thinks this is a wonderful thing that absolutely needs to be done. And other people are doing it too, but they're not doing it properly. They're only doing it with drugs, with things that can be supplied orally in the food of the mice. We are biting the proper bullet and doing cell therapies and gene therapies, as well as other things with pharmaceuticals. So, and we are unique in this. So our work is, I believe, far and away the most valuable of any work that's going on in the field right now, in terms of the amount of information gained, the amount of acceleration of achieving longevity escape velocity relative to the expense. But unfortunately, the expense is quite considerable. The experiment that we're doing right now, which we began in early 2023, it's nearly done, which takes 4 interventions and giving them all to mice that are already in middle age when we start, and trying to make them live longer and checking their health all the time and everything, it costs $3.5 million. Now that's a very small proportion of the $1 billion a year that Evolution are putting into things.
Yeah.
But because our work is non-standard, they're not giving us any money. It's outrageous. And they don't even have a system for giving us money. The people there that I speak to are, very enthusiastic about the work in principle, but they say, we have procedures. They don't want to piss anybody off by going outside of the standard politically correct established mechanism. It's like it's very disheartening.
And the trial you're doing, is that described as like a phase 3 trial? Or?
No, the phases are for clinical trials, for people, for when you get to humans. So
Okay.
what we're doing is we're only working in mice. It
Okay.
still costs $3.5 million,
Wow.
um, but yeah, we're only working in mice.
So first of all, this trial you're doing, how long is the trial?
Started in February of last year, so it's been going for, 21 months so far. It's nearly done. We've got a couple of months to go, probably, until the last mice are dead. So not very long, really.
And then once the trial is over, and assuming that the results are to your satisfaction, that we can move forward, like what's the next step? Where does that go then?
Great question. So it depends what you mean by satisfaction. So, of course, we have most of the results already. Most of the mice are already dead. There's only half a dozen left. So we can look at how long they lived. And sure enough, our therapies did increase lifespan. Now, that was what we would have expected. We would be pretty disappointed if they had not done, because each of them individually had extended lifespan in other people's experiments over the years. But at least it shows that we're doing the thing right, and we're getting additivity. We're getting more improvement of lifespan when the mice are getting all of the things than if they're only getting one of them. So that's great. But we're not getting as much as we need in order to really get people excited. If you start at 18 months and you do things that we could do already, then you can get maybe 4 months of increase of life. That's been done many times, even decades ago, using what's called calorie restriction, just giving the mice less food than what they would like.
I'm sorry,
And
4 months for the mice life, yes?
Yeah, that's right. So the mice
How
are
long is a lifespan for a mice?
so
Mouse?
these mice that we use, which nearly everybody else uses as well, they
Okay.
are a strain of mice that lives on average about 2.5 years. So we
Okay. So we
start
could
when the
add
mice
4 months to that.
yeah, so we start when the mice are already 1.5 years old,
Mhm.
right? So so people can already add 4 months to that. Now we are achieving that 4 months, but we're not really exceeding it much. So we want to exceed it. We want to find different interventions, different dosages, maybe more interventions. We want to carry on doing these experiments until we get a lot more than 4 months. Our actual aim is to get 12 months, to get 3 times what people have achieved in the past. We believe that when we can do that, we will be in a completely different world in terms of humanity's expectations of what can be done in humans in the foreseeable future. So that's what we want to achieve, both for scientific reasons and for, if you like, rhetorical reasons.
And because I've heard you talk about how we've talked about it now, but also in other talks, how money is tight and any donations would be welcomed.
Yes.
Um, I can imagine from like a layperson's point of view, they might think this is like they're talking about in millions and billions, and what's my little donation going to do? So, how would you address that? Do you think that would be beneficial for people to donate wherever they can, or are you looking at big players who can give big money?
Really, every dollar counts. Um, um, it's, you know, whether we get our money from a small number of large donations or a large number of small donations, it all adds up.
Yeah,
So, this is why I do so many podcasts and interviews and so on. I want to reach as many people as possible and get the word out there so that everybody can do this. Also, I always emphasize that if you're not a wealthy individual, the less wealthy you are, the more people you know who are wealthier than you. So, advocacy matters as well, getting the word
yeah,
out to your friends and your family and your colleagues.
brilliant. Yeah, and I think it is really great how you do attend so many podcasts and public talks. It is amazing. And I think it's good for us, and I can see how it'd be good for the work you're doing for people to know what's going on, so that they can kind of, if nothing else, raise awareness.
Absolutely.
Something comes to mind as you were describing the whole process. So, in terms of like the work you're doing, longevity, what are we talking about? So, if we can eliminate age related illnesses, does that mean we can? So, what about people who are born with disabilities, for example? Um, and there's so many different types of disabilities, and each one would have a different cause to it.
Yeah.
So, so suppose if you're, I don't know, if you're born blind, then you're lacking maybe, I don't know, certain cells in your eyes, in your retina, or whatever it may be. Does that mean so you'll have lots of people living very long, but those people will have their pre-existing disability that could then get passed on from generation to generation?
Yeah, great question. So there are really two different scenarios that you're talking about there. One is a scenario in which you're born with something missing, like you
Hmm.
were saying, maybe your optic nerve didn't develop or something like that.
Yeah,
Another scenario is you're born with a congenital defect, where when you're born, you're fine, but you get sick very early, like in childhood or whatever. And the reason that happens is because the genetic defect essentially allows some type of damage to accumulate much, much more rapidly than it accumulates in other people, because the thing that's missing, the genetic problem, essentially it means that there's some kind of damage control machinery that's missing. And it turns out that category is really useful for people like me, because the types of damage that tend to accumulate very rapidly and be, fatal in childhood in such people are typically the same types of damage that accumulate in aging much more slowly. But each individual who suffers from the early onset thing, the childhood thing, only has one of the types of damage. So that means that if you're a company, for example, developing a way to eliminate that one type of damage, then you've immediately got a value proposition for investors, namely the treatment group of people who have this accelerated aging problem. they will benefit enormously just from your treatment, whereas people in old age will not. They will only benefit if they have your treatment and they have treatments from everybody else hitting all the other types of damage. So this is actually a business strategy that's being followed very broadly within the field right now. Even if you want to work on aging, you don't work on aging first. You find an orphan disease, an early onset disease like this, that you can validate your thing, get it approved by the FDA and so on, make some money, and then label expand, as it's called, to work on older things. Now, the other part of the question of how are we going to manage people um,
Are
who
missing
are
some.
missing
Yeah.
things, right? That involves usually a different kind of intervention, but again, it's an intervention that can benefit from the same kinds of technologies. A lot of what we want to do in um, in repairing the body is comes under the heading of regeneration, which essentially means getting the body in one way or another to recapitulate what happened during development, during before birth and as until we become an adult. So let's take, for example, um, the immune system. The immune system, a large part of why the immune system doesn't work so well in the elderly is because we have an atrophy of an organ called the thymus, right? Now, the thymus is important for the creation of a particular type of immune cell called T cell. Now, um, so a lot of people are interested in getting the body to just regrow a thymus so that it can make these T cells again. And there's been quite a bit of progress in making that happen, even in the clinic, even in humans. But of course, some people just might be born without a thymus, period, right? So then what would you do? You would, you might be able to use the same treatments to get them to grow a thymus when they never had one. Sometimes it wouldn't work in situ like that. Sometimes it would be surgical. You'd actually grow a thymus artificially in the laboratory and then you'd do a transplant. And of course, that would apply not just for a thymus, but also maybe for the heart and so on. So, yes, so basically, there are, if you like, knock on benefits for things other than aging all over the place. And I can't think of a single aspect of handicaps that one is born with of this kind that that would be, out, that would be off limits, if you like.
That's so amazing. Um, I've got daughters who go to like high school and secondary school, and sometimes when we talk about like what they want to do when they grow up and what career they want to have, quite often I'm telling them that first of all, society is changing so rapidly that whatever career you choose, the chances are you're not going to be doing that all the way to retirement. So you just have to be adaptable and you have to have the basic skills to kind of understand that and adapt. And the second thing is you're going to have a longer lifespan. So again, you're not going to have a single career. But when I used to say to them, you're going to have a longer lifetime, I was not thinking thousands of years. I was thinking maybe 100 years or 150 years or something. So if in your family, friend circles, people with younger kids, what do you advise? Um, what advice would you give them, or do you normally give them when they talk about like what they're thinking for careers and things like that?
Well, so adaptability, absolutely. And of course, this is already well understood. Education has already shifted in that direction because already with today's lifespans and today's rate of progress in technology, stuff that you learn in school or in university is likely to be essentially irrelevant by the time you're 40, right? Um, so, yes, learning how to learn is far more important than learning facts already. Um, but uh, with regard to the rest of your question, I believe this comes under the same heading that I was talking about earlier. Just like, don't even bother thinking about what you're going to be doing when you're 150, because that's a long time in the future. And we've just got, it's completely pointless because there's so many things that
Yeah,
are going to be true then that we can't even imagine, let alone predict.
very true. Aubrey, thank you so much. This has been such a interesting discussion. I'd love to have you back maybe sometime end of next year or something to just see how things are developing, how it's progressing. Would you be able to, if you like, you can mention any websites, anything now, or also share them with me so I can put them into the notes so people
Yeah,
can
sure.
kind of
I
follow your
mean,
work.
You already have my email address.
Yep.
So, of course, my website, my foundation's website is the same domain, levf.org. Please do put it in the show notes. And if one goes there, then one can discover absolutely everything that we're doing, everything we want to do. And of course, there's a nice big friendly donate button right at the top.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Aubrey.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Take
Bye
care.
for now.
Bye.